Martial Peak, Chapter 5993, The Mighty Current of the Dragon Pool. Martial Peak on the main battlefield, the difficult situation faced by the Allied army had been greatly eased, all thanks to Zhang Ruoxi. The Black Ink clan had paid an exorbitant price to take down Zhang Ruoxi, resulting in the loss of hundreds of royal lords and yielding less than desirable results. If the human race army had not desperately escorted the 8 divine spirits to aid her at the last moment, the Black Ink clan's plans to kill Zhang Ruoxi, she would most likely have succeeded. And once she was dead, there would no longer be anybody on the battlefield with sufficient strength to pose a threat to the Black Ink clan. At that moment, the 2 giant spirit gods were trapped by over 100 royal lords. They were too busy fending for themselves to spare any energy to rescue the human race army. Fortunately, Zhang Ruoxi eventually won the battle. The price of her victory was the lives of 5 divine spirits, but all the royal lords surrounding and besieging her had been eliminated in exchange. Furthermore, Su Yan had successfully been crowned as the Phoenix Empress. The enormous figure of the Ice Phoenix radiated with a bone-chilling cold that froze everything in its wake. Even space itself was no exception. Be that as it may, the situation remained bleak. The Black Ink clan had twice as many troops as the Allied army, which gave them a numerical advantage that was difficult to overcome. Furthermore, not all of the royal lords had been eliminated in the skirmish with Zhang Ruoxi. The enemy had preserved enough royal lords to maintain the situation on the main battlefield despite their attempt to kill Zhang Ruoxi. At this moment, the difference in strength between the 2 sides had not shrunk, but instead increased significantly. The main cause for this was that the small stone race died at a much faster rate than the Black Ink clan. Su Yan's rebirth had only managed to help stabilize the situation by a small margin. The human race army would need an even greater injection of strength to prevent things from deteriorating, much less win the battle. A continuous wave of dragon roars reverberated throughout the void. When the power of Yang Zhao's dragon vein reached a certain limit, the aura of the divine dragon erupted. Then, the body of a 100,000-meter-long white dragon emerged, its enormous dragon head rising high above, overlooking all living creatures from a lofty height. Yang Zhao had succeeded in ascending to the realm of divine dragon. At the same time, the aura of a 9th-order divine spirit radiated from Pai Xiao. 8 divine spirits had stepped forward to help Zhang Ruoxi, and though 5 had died in battle, the remaining 3 had successfully overcome their respective shackles and risen to greater heights. It was important to note that the difference in impact a 9th-order divine spirit like Pai Xiao could play on the battlefield compared to a newly advanced 9th-order human master was enormous. That was because the divine spirits were inherently stronger than 9th-order humans by a large margin. As soon as Yang Zhao and Pai Xiao joined forces and charged into the battlefield, a large swath was cut into the ranks of the Black Ink clan army. The overwhelming aura of the divine spirits flooded the void, causing countless Black Ink clan soldiers to perish. In the distant void, another silver divine dragon was rampaging across the battlefield. His entire body was drenched in blood, and many of his tough dragon scales had been torn or blasted off. This silver divine dragon was none other than Fu Guang. Regardless of his immense strength, he was bound to sustain injuries in such a chaotic and intense battlefield. When Fu Guang saw Yang Zhao charging into the battlefield after becoming a divine dragon, he immediately rushed over towards him. At the same time, a series of dragon roars were exchanged between them, as though they were communicating with each other. It did not take long before Yang Zhao seemed to understand the situation, and he quickly sliced a bloody path through his enemies to approach Fu Guang. A short while later, the 2 divine dragons gathered at the same place. In terms of size alone, Fu Guang was undoubtedly larger than Yang Zhao. This was only natural as Fu Guang had been a divine dragon for a much longer time. The 2 behemoths began to draw upon the power of their dragon veins, causing their vitality to surge and boil within them. That was not all. They also began to spin in circles at a high speed, with their bodies connected together from end to end. In the beginning, their figures could still be seen. However, they soon blurred into a rapidly rotating blur. Something could vaguely be seen amidst the rapidly spinning circle of light, as though being summoned into existence. Many of the royal lords in the Black Ink clan army couldn't help feeling uncomfortable at the sight. Although they did not know what the two divine dragons were attempting, they knew that their actions would undoubtedly be detrimental to the Black Ink clan. They had to stop the divine dragons at all costs. Hence, more than a dozen royal lords immediately rushed towards the two divine dragons from various directions. Despite their efforts, though, another shocking scene entered their eyes before they could approach the divine dragons. Under the joint efforts of the two divine dragons, a large amount of turbid liquid suddenly gushed out from the dazzling circle of light. The unknown liquid splattered across the void like a spray of mist from a mountain spring, covering everything around them. Then a torrent of water emerged and swept out in all directions. Many of the divine spirits who knew what was happening couldn't help feeling moved by the scene before them. They knew that the Dragon Clan had brought out their strongest trump card in order to obtain victory in this war. The torrent gushing into the void, without restraint, was clearly the waters from the Dragon Pool. The Phoenix Clan had the Phoenix Nest, while the Dragon Clan had the Dragon Pool. These were the foundations of their respective clans. When the Phoenix Clan mobilized the power of the Phoenix Nest against their enemies, the Dragon Clan had not unleashed the power of the Dragon Pool. It was not that the Dragon Clan did not want to bring out their trump card, but rather that they lacked the ability to perform such a feat under normal circumstances. The act of summoning the Dragon Pool would have required various complicated rituals in addition to the concerted efforts of many Dragon Clan members. Unfortunately, the Dragon Clan simply could not afford the time and energy to perform such intricate rites on such a crisis-ridden battlefield. That was the case until Yang Xiao became a divine dragon. With Fu Guang's cooperation, the two divine dragons joined hands and forcibly summoned the Dragon Pool to the battlefield. The Dragon Pool was the foundation of the Dragon Clan. After all, the existence of the Dragon Pool was the prerequisite for the Dragon Clan to produce endless descendants. Not to mention, the power of the Dragon Pool was diligently accumulated over countless generations of the Dragon Clan. Regardless of whether the war would end in victory or defeat today, the Dragon Clan would inevitably suffer unimaginable losses by summoning the Dragon Pool on such a chaotic battlefield. It would be impossible to restore the lost energy without several hundreds of thousands of years of recuperation. Nevertheless, there was no denying that the effects of summoning the Dragon Pool were remarkable. The waters of the Dragon Pool turned into a raging torrent that swept out in all directions, and the Black Ink clan soldiers caught within this flood instantly perished. The power of the Dragon Pool was an unstoppable force. If a dragon bearing the Dragon Clan bloodline came into contact with the Dragon Pool's waters, they would be able to enhance their bloodline and increase their strength. On the contrary, the waters of the Dragon Pool were a lethal poison to living creatures without the power of a dragon vein in their bodies. Everywhere the mighty current flowed, death followed. Even one of the royal lords rushing towards the two divine dragons who accidentally got caught in the current only managed to struggle for a few breaths before he dissolved into the rampaging waters. It was a grand display of the terrifying power within the mighty current of the Dragon Pool. Needless to say, the current did not pose any threat to beings like the royal lords and the territory lords as long as they remained on guard. The power emanating from the Dragon Pool might be impressive, but powerful masters only needed to avoid the waters by a certain margin to remain unaffected. However, it was never Fu Guang's intention to target the enemy masters when he joined forces with Yang Xiao to summon the Dragon Pool. His goal had always been the Black Ink clan army. The royal lords and the territory lords could easily dodge the raging currents, but the Black Ink clan soldiers weaker than the territory lords were not so capable. Therefore, the troops of the Black Ink clan army were now perishing in droves. Some small stone race members fighting the Black Ink clan army were also caught in the raging torrent, but this couldn't be helped. Although Fu Guang had done his best to summon the dragon pool in an area where only the Black Ink clan was heavily concentrated, he could not exert fine control over the direction in which the mighty current of the dragon pool would flow. Hence, accidental injuries among friendly troops was inevitable. What shocked him, though, was that the small stone race members caught in the raging torrent of the dragon pool did not lose their lives. On the contrary, they simply struggled in the current for some time before they quickly rushed out and resumed fighting. After pondering on it for a moment, though, Fu Guang realized what had happened. These small stone race soldiers might be simple-minded, but their bodies contained a significant amount of power from the burning light and serene glimmer. Even if the power of the dragon pool was both ancient and pure, it was still incomparable to the original powers of Yin and Yang born alongside the universe. The realization completely relieved Fu Guang of his worries. With hindsight, he had to admit that summoning the dragon pool at such a perilous juncture had been a stroke of genius. Following the raging torrent that swept out in all directions, the Black Ink clan army suffered enormous losses, completely eliminating the numerical advantage they originally held. On the other hand, the human race army was small in number and extremely agile in their movements. Hence, it was not difficult for them to avoid the mighty current under Mi Jingluan's command. As for the small stone race, only their formations were scattered by the impact, while they did not suffer any actual casualties. After a while, the dragon pool vanished without a trace. The release of the waters that the dragon pool had accumulated over countless eons instantly changed the entire situation on the battlefield. It was finally time for a counterattack of the allied army of the human and the small stone races. Among the remaining Black Ink clan army, all the royal lords wore solemn expressions on their faces. They simply could not understand this sudden turn of events. How did the Black Ink clan, who should have had an absolute numerical advantage, end up in such dire condition all of a sudden? Without sufficient numerical advantage, it was impossible for the Black Ink clan to be a match for the allied army of the human race and the small stone race. To make matters worse, that terrifying woman was also beginning to take action again. After the three divine spirits advanced to the Ninth Order in quick succession, they immediately charged into the battlefield to resolve the most critical crises. Zhang Ruo, she finally had the chance to catch her breath. As a result, she had watched the entire chain of events unfolding before her, beginning with the dragon pools summoning, the raging currents sweeping out across the battlefield, and finally, the Black Ink clan soldiers being washed away and vanishing from existence. Tightening her grip around the Heaven's Order sword, she murmured under her breath, "Seniors, I'm heading into battle." Big Brother Huang sighed softly, like he wanted to make a comment, but in the end, he said nothing and silently cooperated with Big Sister Lan to help Zhang Ruo. She maintained the balance of power in her body. The Heaven's Order bloodline burned once more, and the wings behind Zhang Ruo's back glowed with a blue and yellow hue. She charged into the battlefield without hesitation, aiming directly at the royal lords besieging Ada and Aer. At this moment, the pressure faced by the allied army on the main battlefield was not that serious. In fact, they were beginning to gain the upper hand. That was why Zhang Ruo, she did not head for the main battlefield. She would not last much longer in battle. So, there was no point in slaughtering some miscellaneous Black Ink clan troops with what little time she had left. It was undoubtedly more cost-efficient to spend her limited strength slaughtering some royal lords instead. Besides, Ada and Aer would be freed as long as she killed enough royal lords. The allied army of the human race and the small stone race would also receive the support of the two giant spirit gods if she succeeded, which might be more effective than providing support by herself. In a flash of yellow and blue, Zhang Ruo she entered the range of the battle where Ada and Aer were located. At this moment, the royal lords besieging the two giant spirit gods were forced to suffer in silence. The royal lords besieging Zhang Ruo she had been completely eradicated, and the numerical advantage of the Black Ink clan army on the main battlefield was quickly being overturned. At this point, the human race army had gained the upper hand in this battle. Even if the royal lords fighting the two giant spirit gods wanted to help their comrades, they did not dare to leave their positions easily. They were only able to keep the two giant spirit gods in check by relying on sufficient numbers to harass them. If any of them stepped away from their position, there was a risk that the delicate balance would be broken. Once the two giant spirit gods broke free of their restraints, it would be impossible to pin them down again. However, it was evident that Zhang Ruo she was coming to help the two giant spirit gods. The royal lords would only be waiting for their imminent deaths if they continued to confront the two giant spirit gods. But showing their backs to these three terrifying enemies would likely just result in them dying faster. At this point, they were stuck in a situation with no hope of escape. Any choice they made would result in a tragic end. Thus, every one of them felt aggrieved and hopeless. Marshall Peak, Chapter 5994, Final Burst of Strength. Marshall Peak, the Black Ink clan's plans to use the royal lords to keep the two giant spirit gods under control failed, as soon as Zhang Ruo she came to the latter's aid. With a flash of her sword, several royal lords perished on the spot. Upon receiving Zhang Ruo she's assistance, Aer immediately struck out at the same time. He reached out his hand and smacked at a royal lord who was hovering around him. Thanks to Aer's heaven-destroying, earth-shattering strength, the royal lord struck by his blow was instantly smashed to pieces. However, Aer paid a heavy price for his actions. The other royal lords immediately took the opportunity to leave numerous wounds on his body, causing blood and flesh to splatter everywhere. Nevertheless, Aer did not back down. Abandoning all defenses, he switched to a violent offensive instead. As time passed, the royal lords steadily perished. When the number of royal lords besieging Aer dropped to half their original number, the restraints and shackles holding him down could no longer be sustained. Aer was freed. Afterwards, his offensive became increasingly violent and vicious. He worked together with Zhang Ruo she to quickly slaughter a few more royal lords around him. And as a result, the remaining royal lords could no longer withstand the pressure of the assault and scattered in various directions. Zhang Ruo she and Aer did not give chase, but instead took the opportunity to rush towards Ada. A feeling of doom washed over the royal lords at this sight. Zhang Ruo she had resolved Aer's predicament by killing off many of the royal lords in the encirclement with her strength alone. And now, she was joining forces with Aer to attack the remaining royal lords. How were they supposed to survive this onslaught, seeing that the situation was not looking good for them? The royal lords besieging Ada hastily abandoned their opponent and fled in all directions. Ada naturally flew into a rage and chased after the fleeing royal lords, but his movements were slow and clumsy due to his enormous size. So how could he catch up to them? In the end, he was stopped by Aer. At this point, Ada had practically lost his ability to think rationally and was acting purely on his instincts. Thus, he immediately turned around and punched out. The punch caused Aer to stagger and lose his balance. Fortunately, Ada realized that he had attacked the wrong person after the first strike, and his anger immediately vanished. He then stood there awkwardly scratching his head. Among the two giant spirit gods, Ada had always been the most simple-minded. In comparison, there was no doubt that Aer was the smarter one. That was also why Zhang Ruo she had decided to rescue Air first when she had the opportunity to help them. Come with me, we'll beat them up together. Air told Duh. Then he turned around and charged towards the main battlefield. De obediently followed after his brother, quickly forgetting about how he was bullied by the royal lords earlier. On the main battlefield, the appearance of the three Ninth Order divine spirits and the mighty current of the dragon pool had long since leveled the gap in military strength between the two sides. These changes allowed the Allied army to gain the upper hand in the battle over time. Moreover, their advantage swiftly widened when the two giant spirit gods came forward to provide support. Everything had gotten better, and the situation was bound to improve even more. On the other side, Zhang Ruo she was relentlessly chasing down the fleeing royal lords. Her speed was extraordinary. With the slightest flap of her wings, she could ignore the barriers of space and appear before any one of the royal lords in an instant. None survived the slash of the Heaven's Order sword. 1, 2, 5, 10. The royal lords who scattered and fled in all directions had no hope of surviving. On the contrary, their actions simply accelerated the arrival of their demise. When the royal lords finally realized their mistake, they hastily gathered together once more. Unfortunately, there were only some 40 royal lords remaining at this point. These royal lords were originally responsible for surrounding and besieging the giant spirit gods. There had been more than 100 of them in the beginning, but more than half had perished in such a short span of time. Having seen the situation on the main battlefield, they knew that the Black Ink clan had already lost the battle. But so what? As long as they had the Supreme One, they would never be defeated. What they needed to do now was preserve their strength as much as possible. When the Supreme One finished dealing with whatever matters it had to, they would rule the universe under the command of the Supreme One. With these considerations in mind, the royal lords gathered together but did not attack Zhang Ruo. They simply waited quietly and assumed a defensive posture, holding the Heaven's Order sword in both hands. Zhang Ruo smiled slightly, even though her complexion was as pale as a sheet. Their response perfectly aligned with her desires. If they had scattered and fled in different directions, then she would not have been able to eliminate them all. On the contrary, the fact that they gathered together in one place had certainly saved her the trouble of hunting them down. Needless to say, the situation was also a risk to her. If she failed to handle the situation properly, she would most likely suffer catastrophic consequences. Come, Zhang Ruo, she exhaled lightly and stabilized the power in her body. When she looked up, the vitality surrounding her began to boil and burn, and she transformed into a stream of light that charged towards the royal lords. This was her last burst of strength, so she had to act swiftly. She had to finish dealing with these royal lords before the situation fell out of control. When the stream of light crashed into the royal lords, various howls of fury resounded. Blood splattered everywhere, and dismembered limbs scattered across the void. Under the rain of sword slashes that ruthlessly came pouring down, the royal lords perished one after another. The entire incident seemed to last for only a brief moment, but at the same time, there was also a feeling that hundreds of thousands of years had passed in that brief moment. When Zhang Ruo she finally stopped swinging her sword, the void was littered with the dismembered remains of the royal lords. The few survivors opposite her looked petrified. Those short few moments had deeply instilled the true meaning of despair in their hearts. In the face of absolute might, even royal lords like themselves were as weak as ants. Nevertheless, something unexpected occurred. Under the horrified gazes of the royal lords, Zhang Ruo's hands suddenly fell limply to the sides. The vitality that enveloped her body also became extremely weak at this moment. On the other hand, the terrifying aura within her became increasingly intense and unstable. She's at her limits. One of the royal lords yelled in pleasant surprise. The royal lords had extremely keen vision, so they immediately noticed the changes when Zhang Ruo she showed abnormal symptoms. At this moment, the few surviving royal lords finally glimpsed an opportunity to defeat this woman. Hence, they charged forward without hesitation. A sharp look flashed through Zhang Ruoxi's eyes, and she struggled to lift the Heaven's Order sword up again. Big Brother Huang's anxious shout entered her ears at that moment. "You'll die at this rate?" A faint smile appeared on her face, but her hands did not loosen their grip on the sword, instead tightening even more, as she answered calmly, "We all have a predestined time." Big Sister Lan called out anxiously, "If you die, Big Brother Huang's, and my power will surely go out of control. Are you willing to watch this place turn into another chaotic dead territory?" There was no denying that Big Sister Lan was much better at reading hearts when it came to persuading others. Zhang Ruo she was not afraid of death. If her death could bring victory to the human race, she would sacrifice herself without a second thought. However, there would be catastrophic consequences if she lost her life here. Without the coordination of the Heaven's Order bloodline, the power of the two ancient supreme beings would definitely spiral out of control. The enormous void would become another chaotic dead territory in an instant. If that were to happen, the Black Ink clan army would surely be eradicated, but unfortunately, the human race army scattered across the battlefield would also be dragged down with them. The human race had been fighting for millions of years just to obtain peace. At this point, they were only one step away from the dream of so many generations. How could Zhang Ruo she destroy everything at such a critical moment? Marshall Peak. Marshall Peak, Chapter 5995. It's not enough. Marshall Peak after a brief hesitation. Zhang Ruo she abruptly retreated. She no longer dared to carelessly activate the power within her. Therefore, she could only avoid the attacks of the royal lords who were charging forward desperately. Seeing that, the royal lords pursued Zhang Ruo she even more fiercely than before. Ripples suddenly spread out across the void, and in the next moment, a dark blue ice phoenix wrapped in a bone-chilling cold stepped out from the ripples and shot a blast of icy aura at the royal lords who were pursuing Zhang Ruo she. The royal lords were startled by the unexpected arrival and quickly dodged. When they raised their heads once more, their hearts ran cold with fear. Following the appearance of the ice phoenix, several other figures stepped out from the ripples. They were none other than the Ninth Order human masters. The Allied army had completely seized the initiative on the main battlefield. They marched forward in high spirits, with their overwhelming advantage in battle steadily growing larger. Under such circumstances, the outcome of the battle was no longer in question. Their victory was only a matter of time at this point. It was for that reason that Mi Jingluan immediately sent reinforcements when he noticed Zhang Ruo she's predicament. For the sake of ensuring Zhang Ruo she's safety, he did not even hesitate to mobilize Su Yan, who had only just become a Ninth Order divine spirit. After repelling the royal lords who were pursuing Zhang Ruo she, a flash of light appeared around the ice phoenix. The figure shrank rapidly to reveal Su Yan's appearance. She took a step forward and came to Zhang Ruo she's side. Grabbing Zhang Ruo she by the arm, she quickly made a few maneuvers and withdrew from the battlefield. Her next task was to protect Zhang Ruo she until the battle ended. Once Su Yan retreated from the battlefield with Zhang Ruo she, the Ninth Order masters promptly found an opponent for themselves and clashed with the surviving royal lords. As time passed, powerful auras were eliminated one after another. The masters from the Black Ink clan suffered heavy casualties, and the Black Ink clan army was steadily being eradicated. The small stone race army also suffered terrible casualties, but even their deaths played a huge role in the battle. From time to time, flashes of dazzling light would burst out across the battlefield. Those flashes were none other than purifying light. Everywhere the light illuminated, Black Ink strength dissipated and Black Ink clansmen howled in agony. The royal lords and territory lords were perishing all over, and this only accelerated with the destruction of the Black Ink clan army. At a certain moment, the last stubborn royal lord was finally eliminated. The remaining human race army looked around and realized that there were no other enemies around. The battle that lasted for several months with almost no time for respite finally ended with the victory of the Allied army. The small stone race army had suffered a heavy price for the victory. At this moment, less than 30% of their original numbers remained. As for the human race army, about 10 million troops remained when the entire human race army assembled together in one place. Even the number of Ninth Order Masters had reduced by more than half. Among the Ninth Order Masters who lost their lives in battle, most of them were those who advanced recently. Although they managed to break through to the Ninth Order Open Heaven realm, they barely had any time to stabilize and strengthen the foundation. Compared to the veteran Ninth Order Masters, their heritage and control over their own strength was undoubtedly weaker by a significant margin. Furthermore, there were also many injured and crippled among the survivors. The price of victory was extremely heavy, but the victory was ultimately worth the sacrifices. A heaven-shattering burst of cheers rang out soon after. The survivors screamed and rejoiced at the top of their voices, reveling in the ecstasy that overflowed from their hearts. Meanwhile, unlike the ordinary soldiers, the higher-ups in the human race army knew that this war was not over. Although they had finally eradicated the entirety of the Black Ink clan that escaped from the primordial heavens source grand restriction, as long as Mo, the source of the Black Ink clan, was still alive, the Black Ink clan could rise once more. Despite fighting for months, Mo had never appeared on the battlefield. Yang Kai had not shown up either. It could be conceived that these two were battling each other somewhere in the depths of the void, and the outcome of their clash would determine the ultimate fate of the universe. Nobody knew the situation in the depths of the void. Zhang Ruoshi had indeed exchanged blows with Mo for a period, but so much time had passed since then that she could no longer judge the situation on the other side. For that reason, the Allied army only took a brief moment to rest and reorganize their formation after their victory. Then, they began marching into the depths of the void in hopes of helping Yang Kai. There was only one piece of good news that could be confirmed. Yang Kai was definitely alive. That was because they could sense a series of disturbances that were caused by a battle somewhere deep in the void. Those disturbances could only mean that Yang Kai currently had the capital to exchange blows with Mo. Passing through the site where the primordial heavens source grand restriction was originally located, the human race army was shocked by the sight that greeted their eyes. There were countless Black Ink nests scattered throughout the void. Moreover, precious high-rank Black Ink nests could be found everywhere. It was just that there was no sign of activity from any Black Ink clansmen, even though there were so many Black Ink nests. Having dispatched all their military strength to the battlefield for the earlier battle, the Black Ink clan had been completely wiped out as a result. These Black Ink nests were nothing more than decorations now. However, what shocked the human race army was not the countless Black Ink nests scattered everywhere, but the gigantic figures dispersed throughout the void. Those figures were none other than Black Ink giant spirit gods. The outcome of the previous battle would have been even harder to determine if the Black Ink clan had dispatched these Black Ink giant spirit gods to the battlefield. In fact, there was a high possibility that the battle would have ended with the defeat of the Allied army. Fortunately, the Black Ink giant spirit gods were soul clones of Mo, so Mo had to inject a strand of his soul into these behemoths to make them move. Without a strand of Mo's soul, these Black Ink giant spirit gods were nothing more than empty shells. There was nothing the Black Ink clan could do about the Black Ink giant spirit gods, even if they wanted to mobilize them. After passing through the void where the primordial heavens source grand restriction was previously located, the Allied army increased their pace. However, Mi Jingluan's expression grew increasingly solemn as they steadily marched forward. He originally brought the Allied army with the intention of helping Yang Kai, but he also knew that Mo was extremely powerful. The rumors claimed that Mo had reached the legendary creation realm. Even if the Allied army boasted massive numbers, they might not be of much help to Yang Kai. Be that as it may, he was currently faced with a dilemma. At present, it was no longer a question of whether the Allied army could provide any help to Yang Kai, but whether the Allied army could even continue their forward march under the current circumstances. As they marched forward, the shock waves from the battle up ahead became increasingly terrifying. Even now, the mere fallout was enough to shake the entire void. The countless ripples that constantly spread out from the depths of the void were powerful enough to warp space despite their origin being beyond the horizon. Mi Jingluan soon realized that the intensity of the battle between Yang Kai and Mo was unprecedented. At this rate, it was evident that the Allied army would not be of any help. That was because they did not even have the qualification to approach the battlefield. If they forced their way forward, they would be crushed by the fallout before they even arrived. After considering the situation for a time, Mi Jingluan made a decisive decision. He ordered the Allied army to remain on standby at their current position. Then he brought only the masters in or stronger than the Ninth Order with him and resumed their trek to the depths of the void. The small group traveled for some time before the situation on the battlefield finally came into view, but the sight that entered their eyes stopped them cold in their tracks and turned them pale with horror. It did not matter whether they were a Ninth Order master or a Ninth Order divine spirit. Even Ada and Aer were no exception. Yang Kai stood in the void with the Azure Dragon spear in his hand. There seemed to be a small and slender spirit snake wrapped around the body of the spear. In addition, every thrust of his spear contained a heaven-destroying, earth-shattering force. The spirit snake was the manifestation of his space-time river. He had completely refined and absorbed Mu's space-time river into his body now. And although he was robbed of many benefits by Mo during the process, the benefits he gained had already pushed him to his limits. Hence, the fact that Mo had stolen some of the benefits did not affect the overall situation by much. The stolen benefits had only restored some of Mo's strength at most. The spirit snake wrapped around the Azure Dragon spear was Yang Kai's space-time river. It was the result he obtained after countless near-death encounters with Mo. The ability to condense the space-time river into this shape undoubtedly indicated that he had complete control over the power of the space-time river. The intensity and ferocity of this battle were something Yang Kai had never experienced before either. The slightest negligence would lead to his death, and he had indeed suffered several near-death experiences because of Mo. It was fortunate that he had always managed to avoid the worst outcome at the last moment. Mo's vicious attacks had allowed Yang Kai to rapidly gain control over the power of his space-time river. He had been no match for Mo in the beginning, but it had only taken him a few days to reach his current mastery. Originally, Yang Kai could only absorb the Tao strengths into his body by force. When he devoured and refined Mu's space-time river, he had swallowed Mu's space-time river whole and did his best to grasp as much of Mu's last gift as possible. If the Yang Kai from then was compared to a piece of raw, or then his battles with Mo had been various forms of tempering and refinement, every application of Tao strengths and every encounter with Mo had gradually increased his control over the power of the space-time river. The rough and ugly or had been forged into a fine piece of metal now. At this moment, Yang Kai's understanding of the 10,000 Tao strengths had truly reached the peak of enlightenment. The strength he could now exert was no weaker than what Zhang Ruo she had previously displayed at her peak. Unfortunately, it was still not enough. If he wanted to slaughter Mo, then he had to overcome his limits in the Ninth Order Open Heaven realm and advance into a higher realm. only then would he have hope of victory. However, his heritage was insufficient. How could Yang Kai easily overcome his limitations under these circumstances? Not even Mu could achieve such a feat. The more perfectly he could control his powers, the more aware Yang Kai became of his shortcomings. He couldn't reach a higher level of the martial Tao in such a short span of time. He would need to spend long years of precipitation and accumulation before he could ascend. Therefore, he sank into a vicious loop. As long as he failed to overcome his limitations, he would not be able to slaughter Mo. If he wanted to break through to a higher realm of the martial Tao, he would require more time. But how could Mo allow him to have enough time to grow and develop? Ever since Yang Kai condensed his space-time river in the universe furnace, he had found his path to the future. It was just that he failed to realize his discovery until Mu pointed it out to him. Although he could now oppose Mo to a certain extent, he knew in his heart that this situation would not last for long. There were times when one simply lacked the necessary strength, and he was bound to become exhausted at some point. Unfortunately, the same could not be said of Mo. Mo was a strange existence that was born when heaven and earth split apart. As long as his source remained intact, his strength would never be depleted. Furthermore, he was supposedly in the creation realm already. Even if more than 30% of his source had been suppressed and sealed, he was still a mighty being in a realm above the open heaven realm. Yang Kai had finally seen the bizarre means of a being in that realm. Black ink strength that permeated the void could be transformed into a royal lord with a single touch from Mo. The ability to create something out of thin air was simply unimaginable. It was truly fortunate that Yang Kai's current strength was extraordinary, so even a royal lord would only pose a minimal threat to him. That was why Mo stopped using such ineffective tactics after a few attempts and decided to fight Yang Kai with his own strength instead. With each vicious exchange of blows, the violent aftermath that spread out in all directions caused the void to shudder and crack. During one of their confrontations, Yang Kai suddenly heard a slight sound coming from deep within his heart. At the same time, a strange sensation was also transmitted from his arm. Looking down at his arm, he couldn't help being shocked by the sight. A crack had appeared on the as till now indestructible azure dragon spear. Martial Peak. Martial Peak, Chapter 5996, Defeat. Martial Peak, the azure dragon spear, was given to Yang Kai by Ada when he was still living in the star boundary. In other words, the spear had accompanied him for thousands of years, during which they experienced numerous battles and slaughtered countless enemies together. As the spear was an artifact refined from the body of a divine, its grade was so high that it was practically unmatched. Be that as it may, Mo had managed to cause a crack to appear in such an amazing spear. It was easy to imagine the intensity of this battle. After all, even the body of a divine dragon could not withstand the force of Mo's attacks. After the first crack appeared on the spear, a second and third crack quickly followed. It did not take long before the entire body of the spear was covered in fine cracks. The spear was on the verge of shattering to pieces. When Mo noticed the cracks on the spear, a hint of mockery appeared in his eyes, and his attacks became fiercer and fiercer. Yang Kai suppressed the reluctance in his heart and summoned his Tao strengths with all his might. Then he thrust out with his spear. As soon as the violent forces collided with each other, the impact caused his body to freeze for a moment. The spear that had accompanied him for thousands of years simultaneously shattered into 1,000,000 pieces in his hand. Mo had been waiting for this very opportunity. When the azure dragon spear shattered to pieces, he jumped forward and punched Yang Kai. This punch was meant to become the deciding factor of this battle. He strongly believed that Yang Kai would be forced to avoid his blows after losing his weapon. If that was the case, then he could steadily press forward and gain complete control over the flow of the battle until Yang Kai became powerless to fight back. Contrary to expectations, though, Yonkai did not retreat from the blow even after the Azure Dragon's spear shattered to pieces. The space-time river, which was originally wrapped around the body of the spear, seemed to have gained spirituality and clung tightly to his arms. Facing Mo's attack directly, Yonkai threw a punch in Mo's direction. The Tao's strengths fluctuated violently. At the moment when both forces collided with each other, a powerful impact manifested as a visible halo of light centered around the two opponents flashed. The halo of light swiftly spread out in all directions. Everywhere the light passed, space shattered and collapsed. It was quickly followed by the appearance of numerous enormous void cracks. The Ninth Order masters who had arrived at the periphery of the battlefield turned pale with fright. Faced with the approaching fallout of the battle, they quickly summoned their strength to defend themselves against the impact. Nevertheless, they were still sent flying. They, who were no longer at their peak strength, were instantly thrown into disarray by the impact. Luckily, the two giant spirit gods stood in front of them and bore the brunt of the shockwave. It was only thanks to the protection of Ada and Aer that there were no casualties. Once the effects of the aftermath passed, they couldn't help looking slightly flustered and bitter. They originally came here intending to help Yonkai. Halfway into the journey, the Allied army was forced to stop at a distance and discontinue their forward march because the troops could not withstand the overwhelming pressure of the battle. At this moment, they were horrified to discover that even Ninth Order masters like themselves could not approach the battlefield. They would be torn apart by the aftermath of such powerful attacks. As things stood, the only ones who could be depended upon were the two giant spirit gods, Ada and Aer. Mi Jingluan looked up at the two behemoths and instantly realized that the two giant spirit gods could not be counted on either. The survivors were exhausted after the arduous battle. Even Ada and Aer were no exception. While the two giant spirit gods managed to resist the shockwave just now, they were still pushed back significantly by the impact. Under these circumstances, it was impossible for any of them to intervene in the battle. They would only be a burden for Yonkai if they recklessly charged forward. Mi Jingluan was abruptly struck by a saddening realization. The only thing they could do after coming here was to witness the unique battle with their own eyes. That was an unimaginably heartbreaking truth. When the aftermath fully dissipated, everyone looked towards the battlefield from behind Ada and Aer. The scene that greeted them made their hearts tighten with fear. Yonkai was steadily being pushed back, seemingly at a complete disadvantage. Compared to an ancient entity like Mo, Yonkai's heritage was simply too shallow. The slightest negligence or careless mistake could become fatal. Waste. During the battle, Mo suddenly yelled in frustration. Yonkai flew backwards like an arrow released from the bowstring following a vicious strike. The space-time river wrapped around his arm suddenly emerged behind him, and he fell into the river, diffusing some of the impacts from the blow. It did not take long before he stepped out of the river once more. His complexion was pale, and a trickle of blood dripped from the corners of his mouth. Mo did not pursue Yonkai. He simply stared coldly and calmly stated, "My offer from before still stands. Give up your feudal resistance and hand over Mu's inheritance. I guarantee that the human race will have a place to live in the future." Yonkai turned his head to the side and spat out a mouthful of blood. Then he grinned wickedly. "Kill me, then you can deal with the human race as you please." Mo closed his eyes gently. When he opened them once more, his murderous intent overflowed. He did not bother to speak again, and his figure abruptly vanished from where he was standing. By the time he reappeared again, he was already standing in front of Yonkai. The sudden disappearance and reappearance were not a trick of space principles. Rather, his speed had simply reached such an extreme. Yonkai did not seem surprised by these movements. With a backward grab, The space-time river that was originally flowing behind him transformed into a whip and appeared in his hand. The long whip then lashed out towards Mo. Mo frowned slightly, but did not dodge aside. He simply threw a punch instead. The punch struck Yang Kai squarely in the head. The blow made his head arch backwards, and his skull seemed to crack from the impact. He was immediately drenched in blood. Nevertheless, the long whip wrapped around Mo. Standing so close to each other, the blood-drenched Yang Kai grinned at Mo. "I finally caught you." He seemed to have been waiting for this moment. After he finished speaking, he gave the long whip in his hand a sharp flick. The space-time river manifested once more, and the raging currents instantly engulfed the two figures. Before their figures vanished from view, the masters standing in the distance vaguely heard Mo's mocking voice sounding in their ears. "Since you're so eager to die, I will fulfill your wishes." Afterwards, the space-time river that stretched out into the void suddenly boiled and bubbled violently. Meanwhile, the Grand Tao's strengths trembled agitatedly. These were the results of the battle between Yang Kai and Mo in the space-time river. The Ninth Order Open Heaven Realm Masters couldn't help being extremely nervous at the sight. The space-time river was the condensed crystallization of Yang Kai's 10,000 Grand Taos. Even if fighting in the space-time river would give him a considerable advantage over his opponent, that was not enough to overcome the fact that Mo's cultivation was in a higher realm than his. Besides, the Ninth Order Open Heaven Realm Masters had seen the previous battle with their own eyes. Under Mo's powerful offensive, Yang Kai could only parry and defend at most. He had no strength to fight back whatsoever. That was the result of the undeniable gap in their strengths. Rashly dragging his enemy into the space-time river was both an opportunity and a danger. If he failed to defeat Mo in the space-time river, then he would not be able to guarantee his own safety in the space-time river. The churning of the river waters became increasingly turbulent. Waves rose and fell, splashing around fiercely. At the same time, countless Tao strengths appeared and disappeared mysteriously. Although the Ninth Order Masters could not see the ongoing battle, they could deduce that Yang Kai was at a disadvantage just by looking at the changes in the space-time river. The situation lasted for several days. The Ninth Order Masters were about to rush forward to help when the churning river suddenly turned calm. With their hearts in their throats, they watched the space-time river intently. They knew that the outcome of the battle had been decided. Mi Jing Luan immediately sent a transmission to his companions, ordering them to be ready for action at any time. A figure suddenly stepped out of the river. To their horror, the figure that stepped out turned out to be not one, but two figures. Mo held Yang Kai by the head, dragging him with one hand. Yang Kai hung limply from Mo's grasp, as though every bone in his body had been broken. Marshall Peak. Marshall Peak, Chapter 5997, Space-Time Shadow. Marshall Peak standing above the space-time river. Mo held Yang Kai's head as though holding a chicken in his grasp, and snorted, "Useless waste. You don't have the right to continue living." Then he abruptly exerted great strength in his hand. How could Yang Kai, who had lost his ability to fight, withstand such an attack? His head instantly exploded from the impact. However, Mo did not stop there. It punched out and smashed the crippled body to pieces. The scene was imprinted in the eyes of the Ninth Order Masters who were watching the battle from afar. They stood frozen in shock and stared in disbelief. Yang Kai died. The man who was the best at creating miracles and turning the tides of war countless times? The man who had saved the human race from various catastrophes? Did he die just like that? They instinctively refused to believe the scene before them, and subconsciously wondered whether they were looking at an illusion. However, the dissipation of his aura that followed the destruction of his body could not be faked. Everything indicated that he was really dead. Yang Kai had died at the hands of Mo. Only a short moment had passed from the time Yang Kai was dragged out of the space-time river by Mo. Moreover, Mo had not hesitated in the slightest when he killed Yang Kai. Everything happened so quickly that the Ninth Order Masters had no time to even think about rescuing Yang Kai. A shrill but mournful phoenix cry rang out, accompanied by a furious dragon roar. Su Yan and Yang Shao transformed into their divine spirit forms and charged towards Mo. The rest of the Ninth Order Masters also followed suit and sprang into action. Despite knowing that they were no match for Mo, nobody hesitated in the slightest. Now that Yang Kai was dead, there was nobody in this world who could compete with Mo. Black Ink's strength would soon gain complete control over the universe. When that happened, the human race would no longer have a place to live. This was the final struggle. Su Yan was the fastest. After all, the Tao of Space was the bloodline talent of the Phoenix clan. She had lost her mind after being consumed by her feelings of rage and sorrow. At this moment, there was only one thought left in her heart. She wanted revenge, and if she could not have it, she would accompany Yang Kai to the afterlife. A gorgeous trail of light lingered behind the enormous blue figure. With a few flickers, she arrived on the battlefield. However, a bizarre phenomenon occurred before she could unleash her strength. Ripples suddenly emerged in the originally calm space-time river. Following the splashing waves, a figure leapt out. Upon seeing the appearance of the figure, Su Yan froze in shock. Even the Ninth Order Masters behind her were dumbfounded by the sight. The figure who stepped out from the space-time river was none other than Yang Kai, who should have been killed by Mo earlier. He's alive. Everybody stared at the scene in front of them in disbelief. Their reactions were similar to when they watched Yang Kai being killed just now. He had clearly died right before their very eyes, and his death had not been an illusion. Nevertheless, he just walked out of the space-time river alive. The bizarre phenomenon was beyond their comprehension. This kind of resurrection after death was simply impossible. After stepping out from the surging waves, Yang Kai immediately noticed Su Yan and the others. He seemed to have anticipated the current situation and breathed out deeply. "I'm glad I made it back in time." Step back. Su Yan, who had transformed into an ice phoenix, only hesitated for a brief moment before she turned around and retreated backwards. She also manipulated space principles and quickly transported the people behind her away from the battlefield. The Ninth Order Masters were forcefully returned to their previous positions. This location could barely be considered safe from the aftermath of the battle. Xiang Shan frowned deeply. What just happened? Yang Kai had clearly been killed, so how did he come back alive from the space-time river? Although Xiang Shan had lived for many years, he had never encountered such a bizarre sight before. A light flashed through Mi Jingluan's eyes. Creation realm. Could it be the mysteries of the creation realm? What do you mean? Oh, Yang Lai raised an eyebrow at those words. Are you saying that Yang Kai has stepped into the creation realm? Mi Jingluan shook his head. It doesn't seem like it. The Yang Kai who stepped out of the space-time river only had the aura of a Ninth Order Master. It did not seem as though he had ascended to a new realm. Be that as it may, Mi Jingluan had no other explanation for the bizarre phenomenon that they just witnessed. What's more, could reaching the creation realm really allow one to revive from the dead? It was simply outrageous and inconceivable. On the battlefield, Missouri watched Yang Kai reappear from the space-time river and turned to look at the scattered pieces of the dismembered body. After confirming that he had indeed slaughtered Yang Kai earlier, he immediately understood the situation. A shadow. Yang Kai smiled at Mo. I can't fool your eyes after all. Mu and Mo had lived together for such a long time. It was only natural for Mo to know about Mu's methods. Besides, two identical individuals could not exist together unless they originated from different space-times. Mu's shadow technique had transcended the limits of the mundane. In order to suppress and seal Mo's source, she had divided her entire life into 3,000 shadows to protect the 3,000 universe worlds inside her space-time river. Each shadow represented a part of her past, an illusion of sorts that was also real and tangible. Yong-kai had obtained Mu's final gift. Devouring and refining her space-time river had allowed him to massively increase the volume of his own space-time river. At the same time, he also enhanced and improved his attainments and comprehension of the 10,000 grand das. The benefits he received were enormous. Nevertheless, those were not his greatest gains. The greatest benefit he obtained was Mu's shadow technique. That secret technique was definitely the pinnacle of the mysteries of the Grand Das. After fighting Mo, Yong-kai had deeply understood that he was no match for his opponent. That was because he could not overcome his limits and advance to a higher realm within a short time. As long as he could not advance to a higher realm, then his battle with Mo would only end with his defeat and death. Be that as it may, he could not afford to die. The human race would be doomed if he fell here. Since he had no means to advance to the next realm within a short time, his only chance of victory was to master Mu's shadow technique. Just 1 or 2 of him could not compete with Mo, but what about 3 of him? Or 5? Or 10? Mastering the mysterious shadow technique was Yong-kai's only chance at defeating Mo. Therefore, he had mainly been buying time during his previous fight with Mo so that he could integrate the many Tao strengths into his body completely. Mu had not been able to teach Yong-kai about the mystery behind the shadow technique. It was not that she had no intention to teach him the secret technique. On the contrary, it was a secret technique that resulted from reaching the pinnacle of the Grand Das. So it was not something he could learn even if she tried to teach him. The secret technique was something he had to comprehend with his own abilities. Fortunately, Yong-kai had embarked on the same path as Mu. It was for that reason she believed that he would eventually comprehend the mysterious secret technique and understand her intentions for giving him her space-time river. Having come into contact with more than 2,000 of Mu's shadows, Yong-kai already had some vague ideas about the shadow technique before he devoured and refined Mu's space-time river. Furthermore, Mu's final gift had laid down a solid foundation for him. It was thanks to the foundation that he finally understood the secrets of the shadow technique and was able to perform it through his space-time river. There was no denying that Mo had killed him, but the one who died was a copy of himself who had existed at a certain time in the past. Nonetheless, the demise of a shadow was not without cost. Although it was Yong-kai's first time performing the shadow technique, he quickly noticed that something was wrong. He raised a hand to his head in confusion. "It feels like I've forgotten something." He had completely lost his memories of the time during which the deceased shadow of him had existed. Never mind. It probably wasn't anything important. He gave a carefree laugh and looked up at Mo. "Shall we go for round 2? Mo's lips curled upwards. His expression had been sullen throughout the battle with Yong-kai, as though he owed him a massive debt. He also repeatedly made rude and disparaging remarks, but he broke into a smile at this moment. Interesting. The interesting part has yet to come. As soon as the words left Yong-kai's mouth, the Tao strengths lingering around his body began to fluctuate. He arrived in front of Mo in the blink of an eye. The space-time river surged behind him. Raising his arm, Yong-kai summoned the Azure Dragon Spear and thrust it at Mo. The Azure Dragon Spear should have been destroyed, but the Azure Dragon Spear in the space-time that Yong-kai's shadow originated in remained intact. That was why the shattered spear could display its great strength once more. As before, the violent fallout produced by their exchange of blows continuously spread to the surroundings. The spectating Ninth Order masters couldn't help widening their eyes at the sight. They secretly rejoiced that Yong-kai had resurrected in time. With their strength, Mo would have effortlessly killed them if they had rushed forward at the time. It was initially assumed that Yong Kai would be able to persist for a long time even though the battle was not evenly matched in strength. After all, he had displayed his immense strength previously. Unexpectedly, the battle only lasted for 4 hours before Mo found an opening and slammed his fist into Yong Kai's chest. A gaping hole appeared in Yong Kai's chest, then his body exploded into pieces. His aura also swiftly dwindled away into nothing. Despite knowing that he would not experience a true death, the Ninth Order Masters could not help being overwhelmed by sorrow at the sight. After eradicating Yong Kai's second shadow, Mo raised his eyes to look in the direction of the space-time river. He had lived with Mu for such a long time, so he was well aware of the shadow technique's strength. The true strength of the secret technique was not power, but the prominent ability to survive that was granted to the users of the secret technique. The shadow technique was created based on the space-time river, so the foundation of the secret technique was the space-time river itself. In order to completely eradicate a user of the shadow technique, the space-time river must first be destroyed. Otherwise, the user of the shadow technique would never perish. For that reason, Mo immediately aimed for the space-time river as soon as he slaughtered Yong Kai's second shadow. Black ink strength around his body surged to cover the entire river. He planned to corrupt the entire space-time river with black ink strength in order to destroy Yong Kai's shadow technique. But before Mo could make a move, another of Yong Kai's shadow jumped out of the space-time river. Yong Kai instantly summoned the Azure Dragon Spear and launched himself at Mo. He even made a mocking remark, "Why are you in such a hurry?" The two figures resumed their vicious battle once more. During that time, Yong Kai fought Mo while gathering various information on the shadow technique. It was his first time performing the secret technique, so his understanding of it was quite lacking. He had to perfectly master the secret technique as soon as possible because that was the only way he could turn the situation around and obtain victory. If he only relied on a never-ending series of battles via his shadows, he would never be able to defeat Mo. However, Yong Kai would need to make countless attempts and gain experience from actual practice to perfectly master the secret technique as soon as possible. I've forgotten more things, but the memories I deliberately preserved have not been forgotten. That's good news. Yong Kai quietly muttered to himself and resumed battle against Mo. Although he was no match for Mo still, he no longer needed to worry about death. That was why he could afford to act more recklessly than before. Shortly afterwards, Yong Kai gained another important piece of information. The shorter the span of space-time allocated, the weaker the shadow's fighting ability. That is certainly worth noting. When that thought passed through his mind, the strength of his shadow faltered. Yong Kai showed weaknesses in his defenses, so Mo instantly found an opening and slaughtered him. Blood rained all over the void. Despite witnessing similar scenes on several occasions already, the Ninth Order Masters watching the battle from afar still widened their eyes at the sight. What reassured them was that the next Yong Kai had already leapt out of the space-time river almost as soon as the previous Yong Kai died. Marshall Peak. Marshall Peak, Chapter 5998, Contribution from the Future. Marshall Peak, one after another. Yong Kai's shadows stepped out from the space-time river only to perish at Mo's hands. There were no exceptions. The first one had survived the battle for over 4 hours. The second one lasted for less than 4 hours. As for the third, the battle had ended even faster. This is bad. Among those who were watching the battle from a distance, Mi Jingluan's expression turned solemn. He had noticed the issue at hand. It was an extremely serious issue. Although Yong Kai's shadows were endless in supply, his strength seemed to be weakening over time. It was as though time was flowing backwards for him, causing his condition to return to an earlier period with each shadow. At this moment, Yong Kai's aura was only comparable to a newly advanced Ninth Order Master. Hence, he was effortlessly slaughtered by Mo as soon as he stepped out from the space-time river. If the situation continued in this manner, he would not even be able to maintain his cultivation in the Ninth Order. If that were to happen, Mo would be able to exterminate him without even breaking a sweat, no matter how many shadows were to appear. Another one of Yang Kai's shadows in the newly advanced Ninth Order stepped out from the space-time river. Raising a hand, Mo captured the shadow in its grasp and stared at Yang Kai faintly. "You're a disgrace to Mu's legacy." Yang Kai did not panic even though he was captured by Mo. After the repeated deaths of his shadows, he was now very familiar with the feeling of death. Raising an eyebrow at those words, he denied the statement. "That might not be true." Mo looked surprised. "Do you have another trick up your sleeve?" Yang Kai grinned. "Indeed, a trick you've never seen before." "Very good." Mo made a faint smile. While saying so, he exerted some strength into his grip and crushed the shadow in his grasp. In the next moment, another Yang Kai leapt out from the space-time river. However, the aura lingering around him was different this time. Something had obviously changed, as his aura was once again at the peak of his strength. If the foundation of the shadow technique was said to be the space-time river, then the core of the secret technique was the user of the selected space-time. In Yang Kai's case, he was manipulating the 10,000 Tao strengths with his self from this space-time as the core and his space-time river as the foundation. That was how he gained the ability to summon shadows from previous space-time periods. All those who were slaughtered by Mo previously were his shadows. However, the one who walked out of the space-time river now was his main body. It was the him of the current space-time. The foundation and core were extremely important to the shadow technique. Therefore, it was necessary to destroy both aspects to overcome it. Mo had initially wanted to refine the space-time river, but was hindered by Yang Kai's numerous shadows which prevented it from taking action. However, he saw a ray of hope when Yang Kai's main body emerged from the space-time river. The shadow technique would be destroyed as long as the Yang Kai standing before him was eliminated. But could it be that simple? For Yang Kai's main body to emerge from the space-time river at this point, his actions certainly seemed like a desperate move. After all, the shadows that he summoned earlier had been cleanly eradicated. If he summoned any more shadows from earlier space-time periods, he would only have the cultivation of an Eighth Order Master, which would not be able to cause any trouble for Mo at all. Combining the situation with what Yang Kai mentioned just now, Mo had the vague feeling that Yang Kai was about to reveal his trump card. Oddly enough, he found himself looking forward to what was to come for some reason. Yang Kai did not disappoint. When his main body stepped out of the space-time river, he lightly chanted, "I offer 1,000 years of my past in exchange for a contribution from the future. Come." As soon as those words left his mouth, the space-time river behind him began to rumble turbulently. The enormous river abruptly shrunk by a large margin. Then another of Yang Kai's shadow emerged from within the waters. Seeing this, Mo's eyes narrowed slightly. That was because the aura lingering around this shadow was slightly stronger than Yang Kai himself. That should have been impossible. It had to be said that the shadow technique was performed with oneself in the current space-time as the core. For that reason, the summoned shadow could only be formed from oneself that existed in previous space-times. In other words, the summoned shadow should never be stronger than the main body, because the main body was ultimately the strongest. Be that as it may, an exception had appeared in Yang Kai's case. Mo instantly figured out the truth behind the situation and exclaimed in astonishment, "You summoned a shadow from the future?" Only Yang Kai from the future could be stronger than the main body of Yang Kai, who existed in the current space-time. Mo did not remain idle when he raised this question. After realizing that Yang Kai's attainments in the shadow technique had surpassed Mu's, he knew that Yang Kai could not be allowed to continue, so he charged forward even while asking this question. In response, Yang Kai just stood calmly in place. On the other hand, the summoned shadow stepped forward and immediately engaged in an intense battle with Mo. Although he came from 1,000 years in the future, his strength was still limited even though he was slightly stronger than the main body. He was no match for Mo either, but he would have no trouble buying some time for Yang Kai. Furthermore, Yang Kai did not need much time. He then shouted again, "Come!" A second shadow stepped out from the space-time river. It was another Yang Kai who came from another 1,000 years into the future. When the second shadow appeared, the size of the space-time river shrunk again. On the other hand, the aura of Yang Kai and the two shadows instantly became closely interconnected. A three fortunes formation was established. The aura of the second shadow was again stronger than the first. The first shadow had been steadily pushed back by Mo's intense assault, but his situation improved as soon as the three fortunes formation was established, even though he remained at a disadvantage. Again, Yang Kai shouted. The dragon blood in his body boiled and churned, while at the same time his face began to flush red. A third shadow stepped out from the space-time river. Glancing at the main body, he nodded lightly before he directly charged onto the battlefield. The three fortunes formation also instantly transformed into the four symbols formation. Again, golden blood trickled out of Yang Kai's nose as a fourth shadow emerged, and the four symbols formation evolved into a five elements formation. Shadow after shadow emerged from the space-time river without pause. Only when the eighth shadow was summoned did Yang Kai finally stop. It was not that he no longer wanted to continue, but rather that the volume of his space-time river would shrink by a certain extent whenever he summoned a shadow from the future, and the space-time river had vanished completely after he summoned the eighth shadow. He had reached the absolute limit of his shadow technique. At this moment, Yang Kai's main body was bleeding from all 7 of his orifices. It was evident that he had endured tremendous pressure in order to pull this feat off. The shadows that appeared towards the end possessed increasingly powerful auras. When the 6th shadow emerged, its aura had already reached the absolute peak of the 9th order. It was a stage that even Yang Kai's main body had not achieved. The 7th and the 8th shadows also had auras at the peak of the 9th order, but their auras had become even more profound. Looking at Mo, who was being besieged and steadily repelled by the shadows on the battlefield, Yang Kai smiled, even though he was covered in blood. In truth, the shadows were already capable of fighting Mo on an equal footing when the 6 Paths formation was formed. Therefore, Mo's situation then became more and more critical when it later evolved to become the 7 stars, 8 trigrams, and ultimately 9 palaces formation. The ones who established the battle formation were all Yang Kais. To be more precise, they were Yang Kais from future space-times. This was a feat that even Mu could not achieve. Her shadow technique could only summon shadows of her past because her space-time river was incomplete, but that was not the case for Yang Kai. His space-time river had been perfected, so the power of the shadow technique he wielded was even more terrifying. Martial Peak. Martial Peak, Chapter 5999. Clash of the Strongest. Martial Peak, each shadow represented a Yang Kai from subsequent 1,000-year periods in the future. In other words, the 8 shadows represented 8,000 years worth of future space-time. These 8 shadows combined with Yang Kai's main body to establish the 9 palaces formation. For that reason, the power of the battle formation was even greater than the 9 palaces formation formed between Zhang Ruo Shi and her 8 personal guard. Zhang Ruo Shi, who had harmonized the power of Yin and Yang with her Heaven's Order bloodline, was certainly stronger than any of Yang Kai's individual shadows. Be that as it may, the strength of the 8 personal guards had held her back. Taking the overall situation into account, Yang Kai's Nine Palaces formation was undoubtedly the strongest Nine Palaces formations that had appeared on the battlefield. Moreover, the difference in strength was significant. After establishing the Nine Palaces formation, Yang Kai's main body took a step forward and charged towards Mo with the combined strength of the other 8 shadows. The Six Paths formation was already sufficient for Yang Kai to fight Mo on even terms, so the 7 Stars formation and 8 Trigrams formations had left Mo at a complete disadvantage. At this moment, Yang Kai was practically invincible thanks to the Nine Palaces formation. With the combined forces of the main body and 8 shadows, Mo was powerless against their intense assault. Black blood and black ink strength splattered everywhere. The 9 Yang Kais moved around swiftly, each one of them having mastered the 10,000 grand das. As they were shadows of Yang Kai himself, there was no need for them to worry about their cooperation. The connection between the shadows was so close and firm that there were no flaws in their movements at all. Mo naturally wanted to break free, but it was not easy to escape the besiegement of the battle formation. The Ninth Order Masters, watching the battle from afar, were stunned. Nobody could have imagined that such a strange scene would appear during the final battle. The mysteries of the shadow technique had exceeded their comprehension and imagination. Looking at the current situation, they couldn't help feeling hopeful and excited. That was because they finally saw a glimpse of hope in defeating Mo. In the past, the issue of defeating Mo had always been a plague to the human race. Although they never deliberately avoided the topic, the reality was that they simply did not have sufficient means or strength to oppose Mo Zhangruoxi's support. Had certainly been a pleasant surprise. Unfortunately, even she was not strong enough to compete with Mo in battle. The battle on the main battlefield was over, and the entire Black Ink clan had been obliterated. If Yang Kai could defeat Mo, then the Black Ink crisis that had been plaguing the human race since the late ancient era would be resolved in one fell swoop. A bright future was awaiting the human race. The light would eventually expunge all darkness. However, the veteran Ninth Order Masters soon began to look worried. The current situation might be favorable for them, but nobody knew what price Yang Kai had paid to wield the shadow technique like this. Seeing as the secret technique far exceeded his own abilities, the price he paid would correspond to the strength he obtained. In other words, the greater the strength Yang Kai obtained, the greater the price he had to pay. Furthermore, they did not know how long he could persevere in such an intense battle. The truth was just as they feared. Yang Kai had indeed paid an unimaginable price to wield the shadow technique in such a fashion. His body was also forced to bear the incredible pressure that came from obtaining strength that exceeded his own abilities. In other words, he could not maintain this state for long. He had to finish this battle as soon as possible, and for that reason he did not hesitate to join the battle himself just to defeat Mo a little faster. Mo was steadily being pushed back under the suppression of the Nine Palaces formation. At this point, he was backed into a corner with no ability to fight back. The vexing situation infuriated Mo. As the ancient supreme being, he was a master who not only originated from the same era as Mu, but also once held the opportunity to reign over the entire universe. Even if more than 30% of his source had been suppressed and sealed, he could still not tolerate a junior acting so presumptuously in front of him, especially when this particular junior had stolen Mu's final legacy from him. Amid the intense battle, Mo abruptly turned to look in a certain direction and fixed his gaze on one of Yang Kai's figures. Naturally, it was Yang Kai's main body. The main body was easy to identify. Not only was the aura of the main body the weakest among the other shadows, but the appearance of the main body was also the most disheveled and worse for wear due to the effects of performing the shadow technique. To break the shadow technique, it was necessary to either destroy the space-time river that acted as the foundation or the main body that acted as the core. At this moment, The space-time river was nowhere to be seen because it had been evenly divided between Yang Kai's 8 shadows. In that case, Mo only had one option left. Mo turned to face the storm of attacks coming from so many shadows and disregarded the injuries he sustained, even when the strongest shadow chopped off his arm. In the end, the heavy price he paid was worthwhile indeed. He successfully broke out of the encirclement created by the shadows and arrived in front of Yang Kai's main body. Black Ink's strength surged. Raising his remaining hand, Mo blasted his fist at Yang Kai. The punch was quite a distance away from Yang Kai. Nevertheless, the force of the punch was enough to cause space to shatter, time to stop, and the universe to collapse. The blow containing Mo's full strength could not be dodged or avoided. Mo could almost see Yang Kai's main body being smashed into paste, and a hint of triumph flashed through the fury in his eyes. But unexpectedly, the imagined scene did not appear. Despite the incoming blow, Yang Kai's main body did not show the slightest trace of panic. On the contrary, he stepped forward and threw himself in the direction of the blow. Mo was stunned by the strange turn of events. Meanwhile, Yang Kai's main body suddenly unleashed a burst of power that far exceeded his own strength. The force directly penetrated the shackles of space and caused the stagnant time to flow again. Then he punched out at the same time. Damn it! Mo abruptly realized that he had fallen into a trap. For a long time now, the core of the 9 Palaces formation had always been sustained by the strongest shadow. Nevertheless, the fact that Yang Kai's main body could exert such a powerful burst of strength indicated that the core of the 9 Palaces formation could be transferred to the main body. The method to break the shadow technique was to defeat the body which existed in the current space-time. That was something both Mo and Yang Kai knew, seeing as the former was bound to target the main body. How could the latter not take precautions? It could even be said that Yang Kai had been waiting for this very moment. A violent force swept out, pushing Mo's figure backwards. In the meantime, the 8 shadows attacked from all directions. Dao's strengths fluctuated wildly, and the barrage of attacks left Mo staggering from the impact. If that were all, Mo's situation would have been bad enough. However, each of the 8 shadows actually exerted strength that far exceeded their limits with every blow that they unleashed. The position as core of the formation was constantly being transferred around. To be precise, the position as core was instantly transferred to whichever shadow was attacking Mo at the time. Such a feat would have been impossible to achieve if it was any other configuration for the makeup of the battle formation, but Yang Kai could freely transfer the position as core between his main body and his shadows without any obstruction. This was the same strategy that Zhang Ruoshi had carried out previously. She and her 8 personal guard had both been the cores, and not the cores at the same time. Such a perfect 9 Palaces formation could be said to have no flaws whatsoever. More importantly, there was no need to fear the weak links being targeted. In fact, there was only one method to destroy this battle formation, which was to totally annihilate it by brute force. The biggest reason why Zhang Ruoshi had been defeated by Mo was that her personal guard could not withstand the intensity and ferocity of the battle. Transferring the core position to her personal guard was a huge burden on their bodies. Each time they became the core, they would also suffer heavy damage from the pressure. Hence, there was a risk of their bodies collapsing after numerous transfers. The same was also true for Yang Kai. In fact, the burden was greatest on his main body. The main body had already been greatly weakened after performing the shadow technique. With the addition of the pressure from being the core of the formation, he couldn't help vigorously coughing up blood, his complexion turning as pale as a sheet. Be that as it may, he did not hesitate in the slightest. Taking full advantage of the opening created by the 8 shadows who were besieging Mo, Yang Kai stepped forward and approached Mo's arm that had been severed earlier. Although the arm was bleeding profusely, it was not a fully physical body part. Open Yong Kai raised his arm and pointed at the arm. His divine sense surged turbulently. A moment later, a huge set of doors suddenly appeared in front of him. The door opened slightly to reveal a small gap, and then an indescribable pulling force seeped out from within and devoured the entire severed arm. This arm contained part of Mo's source. Previously, some 30% of Mo's source had been suppressed and sealed by Yong Kai with the help of the profound source gate. If Yong Kai could not suppress and seal this piece of Mo's source quickly, the opportunity to retrieve his severed arm and reabsorb the piece of his source he had lost would remain. Once Mo did so, he would return to full strength again. Now that this piece of his source had been sealed, Mo's aura dropped significantly. Although black ink strength surged at the spot where his arm had been severed and formed a new limb in the blink of an eye, the power that had been suppressed and sealed could no longer return. With the success of this attack, Yong Kai's confidence increased tremendously. This was the first crucial step towards victory. It was also the hardest and most dangerous step in the entire process. This step had paved the way for the rest of the path, making what came next easier. Retrieving the profound source gate, Yong Kai turned around and charged towards Mo. The furious battle resumed once more. The secret that the position as core of the 9 Palaces formation could be freely transferred between the shadows had already been exposed. Therefore, Yong Kai had no reason to hide his movements anymore. Dao's strengths fluctuated violently around him, and his offensive grew increasingly vicious. Mo was already no match for Yong Kai when the 9 Palaces formation was formed, so now that he had lost a part of his source, his situation worsened even more. After a brief but intense battle, one of Yong Kai's shadows found an opening and chopped off one of Mo's arms again. Mo immediately attempted to retrieve his severed arm, but Yong Kai was already prepared for such an opportunity in advance. In the end, Mo was incapable of extricating himself from the battle due to the constant assault by the various shadows. Yong Kai's main body swiftly approached the severed arm, and for the second time, he summoned the profound source gate and devoured the source piece. After completing his task, Yong Kai coughed up another mouthful of blood. He raised his head and glanced at the battlefield. Perceiving the condition of his shadows, he knew that he could not persist for much longer. His main body was not the only one who was severely wounded by now. The rest of the shadows were also in a similar condition. However, only a small portion of these wounds were caused by Mo. Most of them had come from carrying the burden of being the 9 Palaces formation core. Yong Kai's immense strength and heritage had allowed him to bear an unimaginable amount of pressure from being the core. That was only possible because it was him. If it were any other Ninth Order master instead, they would not have been able to withstand the pressure after being a core 3 times in such a situation, regardless of their strength. "I have to end this as quickly as possible," Yong Kai muttered under his breath. Then he stepped forward and joined the battlefield. In the next moment, his strongest shadow took on the boundless pressure from being the core and unleashed a continuous storm of attacks without care whether his body could withstand the burden or not. Mo clearly faltered under the violent bombardment of the strongest shadow. While Mo was busy stewing in rage, the strongest shadow threw himself forward and disregarded Mo's counterattack to restrain Mo firmly. At such a close distance, he grinned at Mo and revealed a sinister row of fangs. Mo immediately understood Yong Kai's intentions. Roaring furiously, he desperately struggled to escape. However, the attacks that came blasting from all directions rained down on Mo and the shadow the next moment. Even the strongest shadow could not withstand this barrage of attacks. Thus, he exploded and disintegrated completely. Likewise, Mo's body was battered from the attack. The left part of his body was gone, revealing the internal organs within his abdomen cavity. Mo staggered backwards weakly. A strange light flashing through his eyes for a moment. Before he could do anything, though, another shadow charged towards him. Marshal Peak. Marshal Peak, Chapter 6000. Many thanks. Marshal Peak, the strongest shadow, had already been shattered, and with that, the 9 palaces formation had also been reduced to the 8 trigrams formation, which significantly reduced its might. At the same time, Mo's aura was not as strong as before. After 2 pieces of his source were sealed by Yang Kai, his aura had been notably weakened. As the remaining 7 shadows attacked Mo, Yang Kai's main body summoned the profound source gate for a 3rd time, suppressing and sealing another piece of Mo's shattered body. Mo's aura weakened once again. The 8 trigrams formation was now sufficient to deal with the current Mo. A series of fearsome attacks struck back the battle formation, destroying another of Yang Kai's shadows. In exchange, Mo once again suffered heavy injuries. The 8 trigrams formation had been reduced to the 7 stars formation. Previously, Yang Kai's shadows had emerged from the space-time river one after another, joining the battle formation and making it stronger, but the situation had reversed now. As more of these shadows perished, the might of the battle formation also began to weaken. The only benefit was that Mo also weakened. Each time a shadow perished, Mo's body would shatter and Yang Kai's main body would seize the opportunity to suppress and seal another piece of the former's source. In the end, all of the shadows disappeared, leaving Yang Kai bleeding all over, staring right across at a miserable and weakened Mo. The current Mo had a large amount of his source suppressed and sealed, which significantly decreased his strength. He was no longer as mighty as before, and even the rich and dense black ink strength lingering around him was now extremely faint, almost invisible. The current Mo had lost more than 90% of his source. In other words, he only had 10% of his peak strength, which was far from prime condition. Right then, several figures flew over and formed a circle surrounding the battlefield. They were the human race masters who had been watching from afar, as well as the giant spiritual gods Ada and Aer. Previously, it was impossible for them to intervene in the battle. Even the 2 giant spiritual gods were unable to approach, let alone the 9th Order masters. However, as Mo's strength suffered with the destruction of Yang Kai's shadows again and again, the spectating masters finally had a chance to be useful. Mo had lost. It was simply impossible for him to deal with so many masters with his current strength. Just the 2 giant spiritual gods alone were enough to overpower him now. Nonetheless, Mo was laughing, his voice sounding extremely cheerful. Zhang Ruo, she stood before Yang Kai with the Heaven's Order sword in her hand, vigilantly staring at Mo. Although Mo was in a miserable state right now, no one knew what kind of methods this ancient being still had hidden up his sleeve. As such, they still had to take necessary precautions. Yang Kai. Mo's smile faded as it shouted at Yang Kai, "Let's settle this." Behind Zhang Ruo, Yang Kai calmed his roiling vitality and replied, "Good, sir." Zhang Ruo, she shouted, "Allow me." She still had the strength to launch one last attack and was confident that she could take down Mo with it. So, she naturally wouldn't let Yang Kai take the risk. "No, there's no need." Yang Kai stepped forward and walked past Zhang Ruo, staring at the nearby Mo. Even as victory was within his grasp, there was no trace of the pride or arrogance on Yang Kai's face as a victor should have. Rather, there was only a complicated expression. "None of you is to interfere," Yang Kai gently ordered. The gathered masters furrowed their brows ever so slightly. In the current situation, the best course of action was undoubtedly to attack together and take down Mo in an instant, ending this disaster that had lasted for millions of years once and for all. However, Yang Kai actually told them not to interfere. No one knew what Yang Kai was thinking or up to. However, out of their trust in Yang Kai, everyone still acquiesced to his demand. Be that as it may, they still maintained their encirclement and focused their auras. If anything happened to Yang Kai, Mo would immediately be attacked from all directions. When dealing with Mo, there was no need to discuss honor or morals. Despite being surrounded on all sides, Mo's expression still remained calm. He simply stared at Yang Kai and shouted, "Come." As soon as he spoke, his figure rushed straight towards Yang Kai, leaving a streak of black light behind him. Simultaneously, Yang Kai also charged towards Mo. The moment the two figures collided, everyone's hearts jumped to their throats. However, the next thing that entered their sight left them relieved. Yang Kai's fist had smashed into Mo's chest, while Mo's fist had stopped right before Yang Kai's head. Mo spurted a mouthful of black blood as his raised fist limply fell, standing at arm's length from one another. When their eyes suddenly met, Mo smiled at Yang Kai. "Many thanks." Yang Kai nodded to him and thought for a moment before adding, "I will let you see the world Mu wished for you to see." Despite the jet-black blood flowing from the corners of Mo's mouth, a free and relieved expression appeared on his face after hearing this. "Then, that's enough." Yang Kai didn't say anything more and summoned the profound source gate. As the gate cracked open, it swallowed Mo whole. Right afterwards, the door slowly closed itself, sealing the endless darkness behind it. Back then, it was Mu who had rescued Mo from behind this door, and after more than 1,000,000 years, Yang Kai had sent him back through it. This ancient being had lived his life. He did not dare say he didn't have any regrets, but at the very least, his life had certainly been quite an exciting one. Yang Kai spurted a mouthful of blood before sitting down cross-legged, taking out a handful of pills from his space ring and stuffing them into his mouth. Everyone immediately rushed to him upon seeing this. Su Yen flew straight behind Yang Kai and sat down, allowing him to lean on her. After a while, Yang Kai's chaotic aura finally started to stabilize. As he opened his eyes, he saw many pairs of eyes gazing at him with worried looks. "I won't die," Yang Kai comforted everyone, allowing them to relax. Mi Jing Luan finally couldn't hold back his curiosity and asked, "Why did you thank Mo at the last moment?" Although no one heard Yang Kai's words of thanks, they could tell what he was saying by reading Yang Kai's lips. Yang Kai heaved a sigh, explaining, from beginning to end, Mo never went all out. "What?" Ouyang Lai was shocked. "He didn't go all out? How is that possible?" The others also had a look of incredulity on their faces. To their surprise, their battle almost ended in mutual destruction even when Yang Kai had given it everything he had. Did that mean Mo would have obtained the final victory if he had not held back? Yang Kai continued, "It's not that Mo didn't use his full strength, but rather that he didn't resort to any of his other tricks. Yang Kai had always been on guard against certain methods. The royal lords had their royal lord secret technique, which could instantly corrupt Eighth Order masters. As the Black Ink Clan's creator, how could Mo not have similar methods? What's more, such a method when used by Mo would surely be far more profound than what a royal lord could produce. Of course, Yang Kai had the soul warming lotus protecting his soul, and the world tree clone protecting his small universe. But even so, he could not say with absolute certainty that they would be able to defend against such a move. Tsang once mentioned that a mere clone could not completely negate Mo's black ink strength. Only the world tree itself would be capable of that. So, when Yang Kai fought with Mo, he had always been on guard. But from beginning to end, Mo had not used that mysterious method. Was it that Mo couldn't? Impossible. He just didn't want to. Even after Yang Kai summoned his 8 shadows, Mo still held a trump card that could have instantly turned the tables. Furthermore, he never needed to fight Yang Kai head-on. He could have just stalled for time, and the 8 shadows from the future space-times would slowly have dissipated. Not to mention, There was even a decent chance Mo could have broken away from the Nine Palaces formation's blockade and escaped. At the very least, it was clear Mo had no such intention. From beginning to end, he had fought with Yang Kai head-on. At first glance, it seemed like Mo wanted to kill Yang Kai no matter the cost, but was that really the case? Therefore, although Mo had been fighting with all his strength against Yang Kai, he had not truly gone all out. Marshall Peak. Marshall Peak, Chapter 6001. Price. Marshall Peak, this was the reason why Yang Kai thanked Mo in the end. I'm afraid this is the end he wanted. Mu had protected the human race and the universe for countless years, and even after her death, she had left behind many contingencies and hidden hands. Although the world was in ruins, and the human race were like ants to Mo, it was still what Mu wanted to protect. Under the premise that the world had someone else strong enough to protect it, Mo was willing to go along with Mu's will. Of course, if Yang Kai didn't have the necessary strength, Mo wouldn't mind killing him. In that case, Mo would have still set aside a great territory for the human race to live and multiply after he dominated the entire universe. This way, the human race wouldn't be wiped out, and he would have a reasonable explanation for Mu. At the end of the day, Mo was not inherently evil. In the late ancient era, he had even protected the human race and took it upon himself to help them gain their freedom. If it weren't for him and the 10 martial ancestors working together, the human race of that era would not have been able to defeat the early ancient era's great monsters. It was just that he was unable to control his gradually growing power and eventually lost his way, especially after Mu's demise. When she died, no one was able to restrain him anymore. Today's ending was something Mo himself probably sought from the start. Everyone sunk into silence after listening to Yang Kai's explanation of what truly happened, as what Mu would want others to know. Their current feelings were tough to describe. Mo's life might have been filled with misery, but he was still the one who had brought about the pain and suffering of the human race for millions of years. Had there been no Mo, the human race would have ruled the world unchallenged after defeating the early ancient era's great monsters. There would not have been a war that lasted for so many eons. The Black Ink disaster had caused unimaginable losses to the human race, with countless elites having sacrificed their lives to bring it to an end. As far as the human race was concerned, no matter how miserable Mo's life had been, it was an irrefutable fact that he was the human race's greatest enemy. As the adage goes, the winner is the king, and the loser is the villain. Kacha. Suddenly, it sounded as if something had cracked. Everyone promptly turned to look at the source and was immediately shocked. "Big brother!" Yang Shui called out, staring at Yang Kai's face in horror. Everyone also looked serious as a crack appeared on Yang Kai's face. It was not a normal wound, and neither was Yang Kai bleeding from it. After the first crack, another one appeared soon after, and then another, and another. They were not just on Yang Kai's face, but on his hands as well. The current Yang Kai looked like a piece of porcelain that was on the verge of shattering, and everyone could feel fearsome Da strengths seeping from these cracks. Yang Kai looked down at his hands and muttered to himself, "It came faster than I expected." He seemed to have anticipated his current situation. "What's happening?" Su Yan asked from behind him, her tender body uncontrollably trembling. After so many years of struggle, Mo was finally defeated, and the Black Ink disaster was resolved. The future belonged to the human race, and it was foreseeable that the world would become a far better place. Yang Kai was the biggest contributor in the final battle, but at this moment, his entire body was shrouded in an inexplicable crisis. Everyone could not help but be nervous. What was even more disturbing was that no one had ever seen such injuries before. Yang Kai gently patted the back of Su Yan's hand, comforting her. "I won't die, but I don't have much time left." "What does that mean?" Xiao Xiao asked. How should I put it? Everyone around him was worried to death. But Yang Kai, the main person involved, remained completely calm and composed. The shadow technique was created by Mu with the space-time river as its foundation. I inherited her legacy and walked the same path as her. So naturally, I can also use this secret technique. However, Mu's space-time river was incomplete, so her shadow technique was actually incomplete. She could only summon shadows from the past, and once those shadows dispersed, the memories of that period would also disappear. On the other hand, I have perfected this secret technique and can summon shadows from the future. Each shadow I summoned in the battle just now was from 1,000 years in my future. Now that the shadows have already been destroyed, I must pay the price. The more powerful a secret technique was, the harder it was to use it. The shadow technique was undoubtedly the most powerful secret technique that had ever appeared in this world, especially since Yang Kai had surpassed his predecessor and used it to defeat Mo. The price he had to pay would definitely not be small either. Once the shadows of the past are destroyed, the memories of the corresponding past will also disappear. So, what kind of price do you have to pay when your future shadow is destroyed? Mi Jingluan asked solemnly. I won't exist in those periods in the future. You won't exist? What do you mean? Although I can't explain it clearly, you can think of it as a literal statement. Mi Jingluan was silent for a moment, digesting this unbelievable news. You summoned 8 shadows. So does that mean 8,000 years of your future just disappeared? Indeed. What happens after 8,000 years? Yang Kai shook his head. I have no idea. After all, this was the first time he had used the shadow technique, so although he knew that he would cease to exist for the next 8,000 years, all traces of his existence would be erased by the space-time Tao strength of the universe. He couldn't say for certain what would happen after that. How could this be? Yang Shui's eyes turned red. It's not a big problem. I should be able to return after 8,000 years, Yang Kai comforted. Despite his assurance, everyone could hear the uncertainty in his voice. His back suddenly became lighter as Su Yan suddenly left. She returned soon after, but this time she brought Yu Rumeng and the others with her. The eyes of all the women turned red as they tried to hold back their grief, preventing their tears from rolling down. Su Yan had already briefed everyone of the situation, so they knew the crisis Yang Kai was about to encounter. In the short time Su Yan was not there, though, further cracks had appeared on Yang Kai, and the leakage of Tao strengths had become more and more obvious. Yang Kai really didn't have much time left, and the backlash from the shadow technique was even stronger than he had imagined. Mi Jingluan shot a glance at the crowd, whereupon everyone apart from Yang Kai's close relatives retreated to the side. The women who had been brought here by Su Yan finally couldn't hold it in any further and burst into tears. In the end, it was Yu Rumeng who acted like the big sister of the family and managed to compose herself first. Before she could say anything more, though, the skin on Yang Kai's face began to peel off and disappear. Even though they were all 8th and 9th order masters now, there was nothing they could do. Everyone held back their grief as they helplessly watched Yang Kai's figure gradually vanish. At the very last moment, Yu Rumeng shouted at Yang Kai, "You heartless bastard! Mark my words, if you don't come back after 8,000 years, I'll take my sisters and marry someone else." Yang Kai gave her a smile. This sounds so familiar. Yu Rumeng's will finally shattered, and she broke into tears. She tightly grabbed Yang Kai's hand and begged, "You must come back. You must." Yang Kai swept his gaze over all of them one by one, as if he wanted to imprint their faces into the depths of his soul, before gently nodding and assuring, "Of course." Right then, scattered specks of light emerged before an enormous river spanning across the void appeared, enveloping Yang Kai. Soon after, an enormous wave came crashing down on him, swallowing him into the river. the river slowly disappeared, and so did Yang Kai along with it, leaving behind a group of women standing there in a daze, their endless sorrow flowing like a river. "Something's not right," Mi Jingluan, who was watching from afar, suddenly whispered before turning to Xiang Shan. "Do you feel it?" Xiang Shan nodded his agreement. "There's something wrong." The other Ninth Order masters more or less felt the same way. Although they couldn't figure out what exactly was wrong, Ninth Order masters were extremely perceptive. Their senses were so sharp that even just a slight disparity around them would arouse their suspicion. Everyone made their respective probes, but none of them were able to find anything amiss. Unable to find anything wrong, they had no choice but to put this matter aside, but they still maintained a certain degree of vigilance. The curtain of the final battle had already fallen. The Allied army had finished off the Black Ink clan army, while Mo had been completely sealed by Yang Kai. Although the greatest contributor had suffered severe backlash from his secret technique and had his existence wiped out by space and time for the next 8,000 years, when all was said and done, the victory needed to be publicized. When Mi Jingluan and the others returned and spread the news that Mo had been ended, the human race army of millions that had been waiting here all cheered and danced in joy. The war that had been going on for millions of years had finally come to an end. Now, all under the heavens belonged to the human race. After the battle, the casualties were counted, and the aftermath was dealt with in an orderly manner. The small stone race army had already withdrawn and returned to the chaotic dead territory through the void corridor. The human race also began their withdrawal half a month later. The void corridor created by Zhang Ruoshi saved the human race a lot of time. Not everyone left, however. Headed by Su Yan and Yuru Meng, Yang Kai's wives, his disciples Yang Shui, Yang Shao, and several others all stayed behind. They remained in the place where Yang Kai had disappeared, quietly waiting for his return. The next 8,000 years would definitely be very dull and long, but so long as they could see Yang Kai the moment he returned, any amount of waiting would be worth it. A fleet of dilapidated warships entered the chaotic dead territory. Through the void corridor, the current Zhang Ruo, she could still somehow maintain the balance of yin and yang in her body, so the chaotic dead territory was now a safe place. Be that as it may, she couldn't maintain this state for much longer. In order to fight Mo and kill the royal lords, she had burned too much of her Heaven's Order bloodline. Once the human race army left the chaotic dead territory, she would break the harmony with the two. At that time, Big Brother Huang and Big Sister Lan would reappear, and Zhang Ruo, she would lose her previous strength. At the end of the day, if she didn't have her Heaven's Order bloodline that could maintain the harmony of yin and yang, she would just be a Ninth Order master. The fleet passed through the chaotic dead territory and soon returned to the 3,000 worlds. Many years ago, when the human race army first set off from the star boundary, they had some 30 million soldiers, but now only slightly more than 10 million remained. Around 60% of the soldiers had died in this final war. Despite the terrible losses compared to the solemn and miserable atmosphere they had when they first set out, everyone was high in spirits, and every warship was buzzing with cheers and laughter, despite the sad state of the army. On a certain purifying black ink warship that was so wrecked that it looked like it would fall apart at any moment, Mi Jingluan was standing at the bow with Xiang Shan beside him. They two calmly listened to the hustle and bustle on the other warships and exchanged a knowing glance. The human race is one, but the greatest contributor is unable to celebrate with us. It's quite regretful. Mi Jingluan couldn't help but lament. Xiang Shan nodded his agreement. Now that I think about it, had he not forced those peace treaties with the Black Ink clan, the human race wouldn't have been able to accumulate enough strength. That's right, Mi Jingluan nodded. By the looks of it, that treaty was an important turning point in the rise of the human race. What was that treaty called? What's it called again? The two Ninth Order masters glanced at each other before the smiles on their faces slowly faded away, gradually replaced by solemn looks. Marshal Peak. Marshal Peak, Chapter 6002, Response. Marshal Peak. While the millions of human race soldiers were making the trek back home, all the Ninth Order Masters gathered aboard the only intact purifying black ink warship remaining. Compared to their peak, the number of Ninth Order Masters had undoubtedly decreased significantly, with many of the recently advanced Ninth Order Masters having perished in the battle. Only 20 or so had managed to survive. Apart from the Ninth Order Masters, Fu Guang was also invited. Everyone took their seats. Most of them were still injured, their auras weak and unstable. The battle ended not that long ago, and even with the recuperative abilities of Ninth Order Masters, it was impossible for them to fully recover in such a short time, especially since the human race was running low on supplies, especially recovery pills. One by one, the Ninth Order Masters noticed the heavy air. They might not have an idea as to why Supreme Commander Mi had gathered all of them together, but they could tell that bad news was in store for them, from his expression. After the last Ninth Order Master took their seat, Mi Jingluan finally started addressing the crowd. "I've summoned you here today to confirm something." He looked around, paused for a moment, then recounted his conversation with Xiang Shan. When the Ninth Order Masters heard this, some were confused, some were lost in thought, and a few who realized the issue right away furrowed their brow. Oh, Yang Lai casually asked, "What's there to fret about with your conversation with Big Head Xiang?" He did not find anything wrong. It sounded just a normal chat to him. "There's a big problem." Mi Jingluan stared at him with a solemn expression, causing Yang Lai to realize the gravity of the situation, despite not understanding what was the problem. Xiang Shan explained, "The peace treaty we signed with the Black Ink Clan back then was of paramount importance and could be said to be the turning point in the entire war. It is impossible for Brother Mi and I to forget the details of such an important matter. It would have been nothing if it was just one of us having a hard time recalling certain trivial points of the treaty, but the problem is that neither of us can remember them. When we were discussing the treaty, both of us were unable to immediately recall even some of the basic details of the agreement. That should be absolutely impossible." "Oh," Yang Lai speculated, frowning, "maybe you're too tired from the battle?" Xiang Shan focused his gaze on him. "Do you remember the first time you met Yang Kai?" "Of course I remember." Oh, Yang Lai replied readily. "How could I forget such a thing?" At that time, he slowly stopped talking. Obviously, he too had noticed the problem as his expression changed, and a furrow appeared on his brow. Xiang Shan then turned to the other Ninth Order Masters and asked, "Everyone, why don't you try recalling your encounters with Yang Kai, or some common knowledge about him?" The Ninth Order Masters complied. Soon, a bewildered look took over everyone's face. Observing everyone's expressions, Yang Lai immediately understood that they too had encountered the same situation as him. He could not help but mumble, "How is this possible?" When Xiang Shan asked him to, Yang Lai attempted to recall the first time he met Yang Kai, but he actually couldn't immediately remember it. It was as if his memory was blocked by an invisible barrier. It was right on the tip of his tongue, but he couldn't enunciate it for some reason. After struggling for a few breaths, he finally remembered that the first time he met Yang Kai was outside Great Evolution Pass. At that time, Yang Lai was on a scouting mission with his disciples, and Yang Kai arrived to meet him under Xiang Shan's orders. At that time, Yang Kai was only a Seventh Order Master. Mi Jingluan's voice sounded in everyone's ears. "It's not just you, after Brother Xiang, and I discovered this problem. We ordered our men to ask the soldiers the same questions, and they too encountered the same situation. Regardless of whether they personally met with Yang Kai or simply heard stories about him, they were unable to immediately recall the details. What caused this phenomenon?" Wu Qing asked in a low voice. He had just tried to recall things about Yang Kai, and it was indeed as Mi Jingluan had described. I don't know the exact reason, but I'm certain it has something to do with his shadow technique. Mi Jingluan continued. Everyone should remember that Yang Kai said that the 8 shadows were summoned from the next 8,000 years. He also said that because those 8 shadows were destroyed, it meant that he would not exist for the next 8,000 years. Everyone nodded in acknowledgement, as all of them were present when Mi Jingluan and Yang Kai were discussing this. Yang Kai said that it was the price he paid to use the shadow technique, but now it seems that Yang Kai himself had underestimated the severity of this price. He thought that the price he had to pay would be to disappear for the next 8,000 years, but in reality, some kind of invisible force is slowly erasing all traces of his existence from this world. So, anything related to him would slowly become blurred in the memories of others. Is such a thing really possible? Oh, Yang Lai found it hard to believe the most direct way one would think that removing the traces of a person's existence in this world meant was to kill that person. But the elimination that everyone encountered now was no longer as simple as just killing Yang Kai. Even their memories of him were being lost. Mi Jingluan added, before Yang Kai used the shadow technique, even I hadn't expected for such a bizarre secret technique to exist. Oh, Yang Lai immediately fell silent. The mysteries of the shadow technique were beyond their comprehension, so the price for using it was also unfathomable. As such, no matter how unbelievable Mi Jingluan's speculations were, there was indeed a possibility they were true. This is just the beginning. What I'm worried about is we might even forget everything about Yang Kai with time. All of the Ninth Order Masters were shocked. As the greatest hero who led the human race to victory and defeated Mo, Yang Kai should be remembered for all generations. But if the human race were to completely forget about him, that would truly be a tragic misfortune. What will happen if we completely forget about Yang Kai? Mi Jingluan asked. No one could answer. He didn't ask anymore, and instead postulated. Before disappearing, Yang Kai said that he would return after 8,000 years, but even he did not sound certain of that. So he might be able to return, or he might completely disappear. Right now, the traces of his existence are slowly being erased, which is akin to him disappearing. If one day everyone completely forgets about him, perhaps he might never appear again. Fu Guang, who had been silent all this time, finally spoke. Supreme Commander Mi, do you mean to say that if many people in this world remember him, and his fame remains widespread, perhaps it can help him return? Mi Jingluan shook his head. I'm not sure, but it is possible. Then it's worth a shot. Fu Guang nodded. However, the most important thing right now is to investigate the speed at which his traces are being erased. Only by confirming this matter can we make appropriate arrangements. Agreed. Agreed. We'll do as Supreme Commander Mi says. After many days of investigation by Ninth Order Masters and questioning thousands of randomly selected soldiers, everyone reached an unfortunate conclusion. The speed at which Yang Kai's traces were being erased was increasing. More and more things related to Yang Kai were being forgotten. At this rate, everything related to Yang Kai would be completely gone in short order. By then, no one in this world would remember that there was once a hero who had saved the entire human race. Mi Jingluan couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. He immediately sent people back to the original location of the primordial heavens source Grand Restriction to inform Su Yan and the others who were staying there. Although Su Yan and the others would most likely notice this on their own, it was always better to be prepared. An advance team had already been sent back to relay the news of their victory to the human race forces in the rear, so a joyful mood was already spreading. When the army returned, they were naturally received with warmth and celebration. The human race army had suffered heavy casualties in this battle, losing more than 60% of its soldiers. Be that as it may, it was all worth it, as in the future, The world would no longer face the threat of black ink's strength. But contrary to the expectations of everyone who had remained behind, the Crusade force showed no signs of celebrating after their return. Instead, they quickly dispersed, as if there was a new mission waiting for them. Soon, great statues were erected in the star boundary, Myriad Monsters world, and everywhere else the human race lived, whether it was a village, a town, or a city. The statue depicted a brave and heroic man wielding a long spear that seemed to have a dragon coiling around it. This man seemed to be staring down an invisible enemy, confronting them in battle. At the base of the statue was Yong Kai's name. Meanwhile, Mi Jingluan entered High Heaven Palace, and with the cooperation of Hua Qingxi and Xianing Chong, gathered all the people who had close relationships with Yong Kai. Afterwards, under Mi Jingluan's supervision, they jointly wrote a biography. Naturally, it was Yong Kai's biography, and it included all the big and small matters that had happened in his life. There were no excessively embellished accounts in it, just the simple and factual descriptions. Nonetheless, anyone who read this biography would understand how magnificent Yong Kai's life was. Everyone would come to know that in the darkest era of the human race, it was he who tore through the darkness and brought a bright ray of hope to them. They would also come to know that Yong Kai had ultimately paid a huge price to finally defeat the ancient being named Mo and end the war between the two races that had lasted for millions of years. Most importantly, they would know that the world could not forget him. Otherwise, he would never be able to return. After this biography was written, countless copies of it were made by High Heaven Palace disciples and distributed to all the places where the human race lived, especially the places where Yong Kai's statue was erected. The Ninth Order Masters even personally placed these jade slips containing Yong Kai's biography into the statues. This way, as long as someone examined the statue, they would be able to immediately perceive the contents of the jade slip and understand Yong Kai's life experiences. Many of the human race's upper echelons were trying their best to prevent the human race from forgetting their greatest hero, Yong Kai. On top of that, the Ninth Order Master once again convened a meeting after the army had returned. Everyone felt that the world was vast and time was difficult to measure, so they decided that the year the Crusade force returned to the star boundary would be designated as the first year of the Void era. Void was a title, the title of one of the greatest heroes that was slowly being forgotten. As time passed away, new generations of humans were born, matured, and aged. Everyone had already forgotten about Yong Kai, even the Ninth Order Masters who had fought alongside him, but the statues that had been erected remained standing tall. Marshall Peak, that you're tuning in to the Mystic Fist YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories